The sky above the northern coast of France was a cold, steel-gray blanket, stretching endlessly into the horizon. It was June 1943, and the war had been raging for nearly 4 years. The hum of the B-17 Flying Fortress engines was a constant companion to the young American airman, Alan Magee, as he stared out the small window of the bomber. The clouds rushed by like a river of silver, and below, the patchwork of farmland and villages seemed peaceful, deceptively serene. Alan was only 21 years old, but he carried the weight of countless missions already flown. He had joined the United States Army Air Forces straight out of high school, driven by a sense of duty and the stories of heroism he had read in newspapers and magazines. The idea of fighting for his country, protecting freedom, and standing against the tyranny of Nazi Germany had filled him with pride. Yet, as the B-17 soared higher into the frigid air, he could not shake the nagging sense of mortality that came with every mission. Every flight could be his last. The crew of the bomber had become more than just colleagues, they were a makeshift family bound by shared fears and shared courage. There was Sergeant Frank Miller, the jovial tail gunner who always cracked jokes to ease the tension, Corporal James Lawson, the navigator, quiet and methodical, often scribbling coordinates and flight paths in his notebook, and Captain Robert Thompson, the stoic pilot whose calm demeanor inspired confidence in the crew even during the most harrowing missions. Alan had grown to trust them implicitly, yet he understood that luck was fickle in the skies above enemy territory. Their target this day was the German rail yards near the city of Saint-Nazaire, a strategic point essential for transporting troops and supplies along the occupied French coast. The mission was perilous, anti-aircraft guns, flak, and German fighters awaited them. Every B-17 that flew these missions faced the real possibility of being shot down, and each crew member understood that survival was far from guaranteed. As they approached the coastline, Alan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his instruments, the cold metal of the bomber under his hands grounding him amidst the chaos of anticipation. Outside, the sky seemed calm, but below, the signs of war were visible, black smoke from bombed towns, shattered rooftops, and the glint of armed vehicles patrolling the fields. The bomber's formation was tight, engines roaring in unison as dozens of B-17s flew like a metallic swarm over enemy territory. They were a target, and every German gunner knew it. Alan's thoughts wandered briefly to his family back home in Erie, Pennsylvania, the letters from his mother, the picture of his father in uniform, the warmth of home. Would he ever see them again? Could he survive the next hour? Suddenly, the familiar rattling of flak shattered the air. Anti-aircraft shells exploded around them in violent orange bursts, shaking the plane violently. The B-17 groaned under the impact, and Alan gripped the metal frame of his seat as a particularly close explosion sent him tumbling. "Brace yourselves." Captain Thompson's voice cut through the chaos, steady but urgent. The bombardier's compartment shuddered with each hit, and the smell of cordite and smoke filled the air. Through it all, Alan remained focused, relying on instinct and training. He had practiced countless emergency procedures, yet nothing could fully prepare a young man for the real, stomach-churning terror of a plane under fire. He could see tracer rounds slicing through the sky, bullets hitting the fuselage with sharp clangs that echoed like gunfire in his chest. One direct hit, and the bomber could spiral into a fiery death. Minutes felt like hours as the B-17 navigated the deadly gauntlet of enemy defenses. The crew shouted orders, pulled levers, and adjusted the plane's course in a desperate dance with fate. Alan's mind alternated between fear and disbelief. He was alive, yet every second could be his last. His training took over as he moved to assist wounded crew members, securing loose equipment, and making sure everyone in his section was prepared for the worst. Then it happened. A violent explosion rocked the plane, a direct hit from a flak shell had torn through the fuselage. Windows shattered, metal buckled, and alarms blared as the bomber began to lose altitude rapidly. Alan was thrown from his seat, the air ripped from his lungs, and he tumbled through the cabin in a terrifying freefall. The world outside became a chaotic blur of sky, clouds, and metal. He knew instinctively that they were going down, but he had no idea if he would survive the coming plunge. Panic surged, yet Alan's mind fought it back. He remembered every piece of training drilled into him during endless hours at the base. Emergency exits, parachute procedures, and brace positions flashed through his mind like a lifeline. He reached for his parachute harness, fumbling as the plane twisted violently. "Jump! Jump!" he screamed internally, over and over, as the roar of engines faded into the wind's terrifying scream. The bomber broke apart under the force of the explosions, and Alan found himself hurled out into the open sky. The rush of air was deafening, and the ground seemed impossibly far below, an endless stretch of fields, forests, and villages. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Alan's life flashed before him, memories of childhood summers, laughter with friends, and his family at home. Every fiber of his being screamed to survive, to cling to life against impossible odds. But then, the unexpected happened. Alan realized his parachute had been damaged in the explosion, it would not deploy properly. The reality of his situation struck him with gut-wrenching clarity. He was falling from nearly 6 kilometers, a distance that should have been fatal. There was no time to think, only to endure, to focus on the impossible task of surviving. In that instant, instinct and pure will took over. Alan twisted his body, positioning himself to reduce terminal impact as much as possible. He scanned the ground for anything that could break his fall, trees, rooftops, the sloping terrain, and prepared for the inevitable collision. Every second stretched into an eternity, and he could feel the air pressure, the biting cold, and the terrifying velocity as he plummeted toward the earth. Moments before impact, the landscape below resolved into a pattern of rooftops, walls, and railway tracks. Alan aimed for a structure that might absorb some of the energy. A train station's roof appeared to offer the best chance. He braced, tightened his fists, and prepared to strike, knowing that even a slight adjustment could mean the difference between life and death. The first contact was violent. The roof splintered under his weight, sending shards of wood and metal scattering in all directions. His body slammed into beams, twisted, and bounced, each impact threatening to end his life. Miraculously, the structure absorbed enough of the fall to prevent instant death. Alan skidded, tumbled, and finally came to rest amidst broken wood, twisted metal, and a cloud of dust. He was battered, broken, and unconscious, yet alive. When Alan finally opened his eyes, the world was a haze of pain, dust, and muted sunlight filtering through the broken roof beams. The train station he had hit was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of distant bombing and the low murmur of shocked townspeople beginning to emerge from their shelters. His body screamed with every movement, broken ribs, cuts, bruises, but a spark of incredulous relief coursed through him. He was alive. The townspeople rushed to his side, their faces a mix of horror and awe. Alan tried to speak but could only croak, the air in his lungs rasping painfully. They gently lifted him from the wreckage, careful not to jostle his fragile body. Somehow, against every law of physics and fate, he had survived a fall that should have obliterated him entirely. Word spread quickly through the village that an American airman had miraculously survived what many presumed to be a fatal fall. Curiosity and cautious excitement mingled with fear. After all, a man falling from the sky without a parachute seemed almost supernatural. Alan was placed on a makeshift stretcher, and villagers carried him to a nearby building, hoping to shield him from further danger and give him the chance to breathe, however faintly. Even as pain racked his body, Alan's mind began to assess his situation. The war was still raging, and he was deep inside occupied France. German soldiers could arrive at any moment, and he was utterly vulnerable. But for now, he had to focus on one thing: surviving the next few hours. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a small victory. The local doctor, a man named Dr. Henri Dubois, arrived and began examining him. Henry's hands were gentle but precise, moving over cuts, bruises, and broken bones. "You are very lucky, monsieur," he murmured in French, his accent thick but understandable. "Most men would not have survived this, not a single one. But you are alive. Alan tried to nod, wincing as pain tore through his body. How, he whispered, barely able to form the words. How did I? Henri shook his head. Miracles are rare, monsieur, but today you are one. The roof, the beams, they saved you. Somehow, they absorbed the force, but you are badly hurt. You must rest. Time seemed to stretch as Alan lay in that building, the world moving slowly around him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by the memory of the fall, the roaring wind, the twisting metal, the sky turning into a blur, the terrible sensation of helplessness as gravity pulled him inexorably toward the earth. And yet, despite the trauma, a sense of wonder filled him. He was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. As night fell over the village, the sounds of war continued in the distance, distant artillery, the hum of aircraft, and the occasional explosion reminding him that the battle was far from over. Alan's thoughts shifted to his crew. The B-17 had been hit, torn apart mid-air. What about the others? Were they alive? Were they captured? Were they even still breathing? Anxiety gnawed at him as he realized he had no answers. In the early hours of the next morning, German soldiers arrived. The occupation was strict, and every American airman found in France was considered a high-value prisoner. Alan, weakened and barely able to stand, was captured and treated not with cruelty, but with cautious professionalism. They bound his hands, checked his identification, and transported him to a local holding area. The irony was not lost on him. He had survived a fall that should have killed him, only to be placed into the hands of the enemy. The transport to the prison camp was grueling. Alan's injuries made every movement agony, yet he endured. Inside the transport truck, he could see other prisoners, men who had not been so fortunate in their missions. The camaraderie of suffering was immediate, they exchanged silent nods, a shared acknowledgement of pain and endurance. Over the next few days, Alan received rudimentary medical attention from the camp's doctor. His broken ribs, crushed vertebrae, and lacerations required careful treatment. It was a painstaking process, but each day he regained a fraction of strength. The resilience that had carried him through the fall now carried him through recovery, and with each passing day, the sense of impossibility grew stronger in his mind. How had he survived? How had fate spared him when countless others perished? The mental toll was as severe as the physical. Nightmares haunted his sleep, visions of falling, of being ripped from the sky, replaying endlessly. Yet amidst the trauma, a quiet determination emerged. He would survive. He would return home. He would live not just because of luck, but because he had the will to endure, the stubborn refusal to accept death. Months passed. Alan's body healed, slowly but surely. He underwent physical therapy and regained some mobility, though scars and pain remained as constant reminders of the day the sky tried to kill him. Meanwhile, news of his survival spread through the ranks back home in America. His story became legendary among airmen, a young man who had fallen 6 kilometers without a parachute and lived. Many refused to believe it, dismissing it as impossible or exaggerated, but the evidence was undeniable. By the end of 1943, Alan was transported to a more secure prisoner of war camp. The experience was difficult, yet he endured, drawing strength from the knowledge that he had cheated death once already. He became a symbol of resilience among his fellow prisoners, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, survival was possible. His calm demeanor, courage, and sheer tenacity inspired others to cling to hope amidst despair. Even as the months turned into years, the fall remained the defining moment of his life. Alan would recount the story countless times, each telling a mix of awe and disbelief. "I don't know how I lived," he would say, voice low, eyes distant. "There was nothing between me and the ground but air, and then somehow, something caught me. I don't believe in luck, not really, but that day, the world gave me a second chance." The psychological impact of the event lingered, shaping Alan into a man profoundly aware of the fragility of life. Every decision, every mission, every moment thereafter was colored by the knowledge that he had faced death in the most literal sense and survived. Yet, he also carried gratitude for the structure that had broken his fall, for the townspeople who had rescued him, and for the chance to continue living a life that had been almost ended in an instant. And so, the young airman who had flown into the skies of war, who had faced anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, who had plummeted 6 kilometers without a parachute, began the slow journey of recovery. Alan Magee's story would go on to inspire generations of soldiers, historians, and ordinary people alike, a story of survival, courage, and the miraculous resilience of the human spirit. Alan Magee awoke to the muted light of a small, dimly lit room. The lingering pain from his fall was overwhelming, yet he could breathe, and that alone felt like a small victory. Outside, the sounds of the occupied French village were muffled, footsteps, the distant hum of vehicles, and occasional German commands filtering through cracked doors and windows. He realized quickly that he was now in the hands of the enemy, far from the safety of his unit, yet the knowledge of survival in the face of impossible odds strengthened his resolve. The German soldiers who had captured him were professional, neither cruel nor overly kind. Their questions were terse, their inspections thorough. Every movement Alan made was scrutinized, every word measured. But despite the immediate danger, a sense of grim relief washed over him. He had survived the fall, and now he would have a chance, however precarious, to see the world beyond that train station. Alan was moved to a holding area with other prisoners, young men like him whose fates had been sealed by circumstance. The atmosphere was tense, fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion hung heavily in the air. Conversations were sparse, most men were too physically and emotionally drained to speak. Yet Alan found a quiet corner and forced himself to focus, recalling every detail of his survival, the roof that had broken his fall, the careful positioning of his body, the sheer luck that had carried him through. That memory became a talisman, a reminder that survival was possible, even when everything seemed hopeless. Days passed in a blur of limited food, rigid routines, and constant monitoring. Alan's injuries required care, but the German camp doctors did what they could under the circumstances. Broken ribs, bruised limbs, and lacerations were treated with basic procedures, bandages, and rest. Each day was a slow, grueling exercise in endurance. Alan discovered reserves of mental and physical strength he had not known existed. The pain, the fear, and the uncertainty were all part of the new reality, and he faced it with the same determination that had kept him alive during the fall. Conversations with fellow prisoners were cautious but revealing. Stories of missions gone wrong, narrow escapes, and losses shared a common theme, the arbitrary cruelty of war. Alan listened carefully, absorbing their experiences while keeping the story of his fall to himself. It seemed impossible that anyone would believe it, even he struggled to fully comprehend what had happened. Survival, he realized, often required silence as much as courage. Weeks turned into months. Alan adapted to life in captivity, though he never lost sight of the ultimate goal, freedom. The monotony of camp life was punctuated by moments of terror, inspections, rumors of executions, and occasional air raids. Each event reminded him that, despite surviving the impossible fall, the war still had many challenges ahead. During this time, Alan reflected on the fragility of human life. The fall from 6 kilometers had been a stark lesson in mortality. Every step, every breath, and every decision thereafter was colored by that understanding. He observed the guards, learned the routines, and began quietly planning small acts of self-preservation. Simple things, knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to move, became critical for survival. One day, a German officer entered the camp with a list of prisoners to be transferred. Alan was among them. He was taken to a larger, more secure facility deeper within occupied France. The journey was exhausting, every jolt and movement reminded him of his injuries. Yet Alan endured. He drew strength from the knowledge that he had survived when death had seemed certain, and he refused to surrender his will. In the new camp, conditions were more regimented. The prisoners were housed in barracks with strict schedules, limited food, and constant oversight. Despite the hardships, camaraderie developed among the men. Alan shared quiet conversations with other airmen, their stories weaving a tapestry of survival, bravery, and human endurance. Each tale was a reminder that while the war tested them, the human spirit could endure extraordinary adversity. As winter approached, Alan faced new challenges. The cold penetrated even the thickest clothing, and the scarcity of proper medical care meant that every minor injury carried the risk of serious complications. Yet Alan adapted, using ingenuity and resilience to protect himself. He learned to ration food, preserve warmth, and avoid unnecessary risks. Every day became a careful balancing act between survival and maintaining hope. Throughout this period, Alan thought often of the day he fell. He replayed it in his mind endlessly, analyzing every movement, every choice, and every moment of luck. That fall had become a defining moment, not just physically, but psychologically. It had tested his endurance, courage, and will to live. And now, in captivity, those same qualities were required to navigate a different kind of peril, one of patience, observation, and quiet defiance. One evening, while sitting in the barracks, Alan overheard guards discussing the incoming news from the front. Allied advances, setbacks, and strategic decisions were debated in hushed tones. Alan's mind raced. He realized that the war was still fluid, and that opportunities for escape, or eventual liberation, might arise. He began to watch carefully, noting patterns, weaknesses, and openings. The lessons of survival in the sky had taught him to anticipate, adapt, and remain alert. Months passed, and the camp slowly became a microcosm of the larger war. Alliances formed among prisoners, small acts of resistance were attempted, and the shared hope of liberation kept spirits alive. Alan became a quiet leader in this environment, offering support, encouragement, and careful guidance. His story of survival, though largely unspoken, imbued him with a sense of authority and respect among the men. During rare moments of solitude, Alan allowed himself to reflect on the emotional impact of his experience. The terror of the fall, the uncertainty of survival, and the constant presence of danger had transformed him. He realized that courage was not a single act, but a continuous choice, made in moments both extraordinary and mundane. Every day in captivity required that same courage, the same commitment to endure against impossible odds. As the seasons changed, news of Allied victories slowly reached the camp. Morale among prisoners fluctuated with each report. Alan listened carefully, understanding that hope could be as dangerous as despair if it led to rash decisions. Yet, he could not deny a growing sense of anticipation, the possibility that freedom might one day arrive. Despite the hardships, Alan continued to cultivate resilience. He practiced small exercises to maintain his physical strength, observed the guards to predict behavior, and maintained mental clarity through reflection and planning. The lessons of survival from the fall had taught him that even in the face of overwhelming danger, human ingenuity and determination could create opportunities where none seemed to exist. In quiet moments, Alan thought about the people who had helped him immediately after his fall, the villagers, the doctors, the soldiers who had captured him. Their actions, whether motivated by duty, compassion, or circumstance, had all played a part in his miraculous survival. It was a reminder that, even in war, human connection could offer a lifeline. As part 2 of his story draws to a close, Alan Magee remains a young airman in the hands of the enemy, battered and scarred but alive. He has endured the impossible fall, faced the brutality of captivity, and cultivated a resilience that will carry him through the darkest days ahead. The war is far from over, but one thing is certain, Alan Magee's story is only beginning, and the human spirit he embodies will continue to defy the odds. The sun had barely risen over the rolling fields of England when Alan Magee climbed into the cockpit of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the metallic roar of the engines shaking the small airfield. His hands, still haunted by memories of past missions, gripped the controls with a mix of fear and determination. This was not just another flight, it was a mission that would push every member of the crew to the limits of courage, skill, and sheer willpower. The B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress, gleamed in the early morning light. Its steel body bore the scars of previous missions, dented panels, faded insignias, and the faint smell of burnt fuel. Alan's heart raced as he climbed aboard, aware that every time he flew over occupied Europe, death hovered invisibly in the clouds, in the flak batteries below, and in the fighters that patrolled the skies. His crewmates greeted him with nods and subdued smiles. They had become more than a team, they were a family forged in the furnace of battle. Each mission tested their trust, skill, and courage. Today, however, the stakes were higher than ever. Their objective was a German-occupied industrial city near St. Nazaire, a hub of rail yards, supply depots, and strategic communications. The mission's success would cripple enemy logistics, but failure could mean death for every man aboard. As the B-17 taxied down the runway, Alan adjusted his gear and checked the emergency procedures once more. Each movement was precise, rehearsed hundreds of times, yet no amount of practice could erase the dread that churned in his stomach. The engines roared louder, and soon the plane lifted into the gray sky, carrying a fragile bundle of hope, fear, and human determination over miles of water and enemy territory. The flight over the English Channel was tense but uneventful. The calm before the storm weighed heavily on Alan, who stared out at the endless expanse of steel-gray waves below. He thought briefly of the letters from home, of his family and friends, and of the life he might never return to. There was no time for doubt, every second required focus. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for enemy aircraft, flak positions, and anything that could threaten the mission. As they approached the coast of France, the tension became unbearable. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ground like a violent storm, tearing through the sky with deafening booms. The plane shuddered with each near miss, and Alan felt the familiar tightening of fear in his chest. He had flown through flak before, but the concentrated barrage over the industrial city was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The B-17 formation pressed forward, each plane a beacon of defiance against a deadly sky. Tracers sliced through clouds, bullets pinged against the fuselage, and the smell of smoke and fuel filled the cabin. Alan moved with precision, assisting wounded crew members, adjusting flak guns, and monitoring instruments. Each man on board knew the stakes. One misstep, one unlucky burst of flak, could send them spiraling into oblivion. Suddenly, the first direct hit struck. The aircraft groaned, metal twisting under the impact. Smoke filled the cockpit as alarms blared and instruments malfunctioned. Captain Robert Thompson barked orders with calm authority, guiding the faltering plane through a chaotic sky. Alan's training took over, every action instinctive, every movement calculated. Yet in his mind, the terrifying thought persisted, what if this is it? What if today is the day he does not survive? Another explosion rocked the fuselage, and the B-17 lurched violently. Alan was thrown against the metal frame, pain searing through his body. Equipment flew in every direction. The world outside became a blur of gray clouds, fiery explosions, and twisting metal. The plane was breaking apart under the relentless assault of German defenses. Alan clung to his training, his crewmates, and the faint hope that survival was still possible. The crew fought valiantly, trying to maintain control of the aircraft, but the damage was catastrophic. Smoke choked the cabin, instruments failed, and flak continued to tear through the sky. Alan realized with growing horror that the plane was going down. Emergency procedures kicked in, parachutes were deployed, or at least attempted, but chaos ruled. Amid the cacophony of alarms, shouts, and explosions, the plane finally gave way. Alan Magee was hurled into the void, the cold rush of wind tearing past him as the ground approached with terrifying speed. He was falling from nearly 6 kilometers, the sky a violent, twisting blur of clouds, steel, and death. For a heartbeat, the world slowed, memories of childhood, family, and past flights flashed before him. He had no parachute that could fully deploy, just a harness that had been damaged by the explosion. The inevitability of death pressed in from all sides. In the midst of the fall, Alan fought instinctively. He twisted his body to reduce the force of impact, spread his limbs to slow his descent, and scanned the terrain below for anything that could soften his landing. Trees, rooftops, and the jagged edges of buildings formed a chaotic patchwork that might, by some miracle, offer a chance at survival. The air screamed around him, biting and cold, as he plummeted toward the earth. Then, in a moment that seemed orchestrated by fate, Alan collided with the roof of a train station. The impact shattered wood and metal, sending him tumbling across the structure. Pain exploded through his body, and unconsciousness threatened to take him. Yet somehow, miraculously, he was alive. The roof had absorbed enough of the force to prevent death. Alan lay among the wreckage, battered and broken, but breathing. Against all odds, he had survived. The villagers who discovered him were stunned. They had never seen anything like it, a young airman, bruised and bloodied, lying amid the debris, alive against every law of nature. Alan was carried gently into a nearby building, treated with cautious hands by a local doctor, and gradually began the slow process of recovery. Pain and fear remained, but the most incredible fact persisted: he was alive. As the days passed, Alan's mind began to absorb the enormity of what had occurred. He had faced the deadliest sky over occupied France, endured flak, explosions, and a fall of 6 kilometers without a functioning parachute, and lived. He realized that the true battle was not just with the enemy, but with chance itself. Each heartbeat, each breath, each small recovery was a triumph of willpower and human resilience. Captured shortly after by German soldiers, Alan was transported to a holding camp. Injured, weakened, but alive, he faced the next challenge: surviving captivity in enemy hands. He quickly learned that resilience was as essential on the ground as it had been in the sky. The months that followed would test him in ways the fall never had, as he confronted hunger, fear, and the psychological trials of imprisonment. Yet even in the grim confines of the camp, Alan's spirit remained unbroken. Fellow prisoners looked to him as an example of endurance and hope. He shared quiet advice, offered support, and became a symbol of the possibility of survival against all odds. The miraculous fall remained a defining event in his life, shaping the man he would become and inspiring those who would hear his story. The cold stone walls of the German prisoner-of-war camp pressed against Alan Magee like the weight of the sky itself. He had survived the unimaginable fall from 6 kilometers, defying every law of nature, and yet now he faced a different kind of trial: the slow, grinding monotony and uncertainty of captivity. Each day was a test of endurance, every interaction with guards a careful negotiation between compliance and survival, every meal a lesson in gratitude and resourcefulness. Alan quickly learned the strict routines of camp life. Wake-up calls came at dawn, harsh and abrupt, followed by roll call, inspections, and labor assignments. The camp was a microcosm of the larger war. Order, hierarchy, and control were maintained with rigid discipline. Guards patrolled relentlessly, and the slightest infraction could invite punishment. Alan moved cautiously, understanding that survival depended not only on physical resilience but on mastering the subtleties of human behavior under duress. Despite the harsh conditions, camaraderie emerged among the prisoners. Men from different units and backgrounds shared their stories, creating a fragile community united by shared adversity. Alan listened, offering encouragement and small advice, drawing upon his own miraculous experience as a testament to hope. Yet he kept the story of his fall mostly to himself. It sounded impossible even to him, and he feared it would invite unwanted attention or skepticism. The injuries from his fall continued to plague him. Broken ribs and bruises made every movement painful, but Alan refused to succumb to despair. He devised small exercises to maintain his strength and flexibility, adapting to the minimal resources available. Other prisoners watched him with a mix of awe and envy, inspired by the young airman who had cheated death once and was now refusing to let captivity defeat him. Weeks turned into months. Alan learned the routines of the guards, the schedules of meals, the timing of roll calls, and the vulnerabilities of the camp. He observed, memorized, and planned silently. Each day offered small opportunities to exercise ingenuity, trading food, exchanging messages, or simply maintaining morale. Alan became a quiet leader among his peers, not through authority, but through example. His calm demeanor and unwavering resilience were a lifeline for those struggling to retain hope. Psychologically, the strain was immense. Sleep was interrupted by nightmares of falling, of explosions, of the relentless pull of gravity that had nearly ended his life. He relived the terror of the flak, the chaos of the disintegrating B-17, and the final, agonizing moments of free fall. But these memories, horrifying as they were, also reinforced a profound understanding: survival was possible even in the direst circumstances. Every day in the camp was a testament to that lesson. Alan began to craft routines to maintain his mental health. Reading scraps of letters from home, writing notes and observations, and quietly reflecting on his experiences helped him retain a sense of identity. He discovered that hope, no matter how fragile, could be cultivated deliberately. It was a skill, a practice, and a necessity for enduring the harsh realities of imprisonment. The camp itself was a complex ecosystem. Officers, guards, and prisoners all operated within unspoken rules and codes. Alan learned to navigate these with precision. He observed tensions between prisoners, identified alliances, and recognized the subtle dynamics that could mean the difference between safety and punishment. The ability to read situations accurately became as critical as physical survival. Hunger was a constant challenge. Meals were sparse and lacked nutrition. Alan learned to ration carefully, trade with fellow prisoners, and sometimes improvise meals from limited supplies. These small acts of ingenuity were victories in themselves, reinforcing his belief in human adaptability. Despite the grim surroundings, moments of humanity appeared. Prisoners shared stories, laughed quietly, and supported each other in small, profound ways. Alan found solace in these moments, recognizing that connection and empathy were as vital as food or warmth. The camaraderie of suffering, the quiet bonds formed in adversity, became pillars of resilience. Over time, Alan observed changes in the camp as the war evolved. Allied advances, air raids, and shifts in German strategy influenced daily life. Rumors of liberation, whispers of approaching Allied forces, circulated cautiously among the prisoners. Each piece of news was scrutinized, weighed, and absorbed with careful hope. Alan learned patience, understanding that endurance often required stillness as much as action. He also reflected deeply on his miraculous survival. The memory of the 6-kilometer fall was ever present, a constant reminder of both human fragility and resilience. It shaped his worldview, instilling an acute awareness of mortality and an appreciation for life in all its precariousness. This awareness guided his actions within the camp, informing his decisions, his relationships, and his sense of purpose. As winter approached, the physical hardships intensified. Cold winds, inadequate clothing, and limited heating tested the prisoners' endurance. Alan adapted, finding ways to conserve warmth, maintain energy, and support fellow prisoners. His presence became a source of strength for those around him. The story of survival, though often untold, radiated through his demeanor and actions. Small victories, finding extra food, surviving inspections without injury, maintaining morale, were celebrated privately. Alan understood that in such circumstances, every act of agency mattered. Each day survived, each pain endured, was a step toward ultimate freedom. Throughout these months, Alan's reputation grew quietly among both prisoners and some guards. They recognized his composure under stress, his intelligence, and his extraordinary endurance. Though he remained modest about his miraculous fall, the aura of survival followed him, a subtle reminder that extraordinary events can redefine what is possible. By the end of Part 4, Alan Magee had fully adapted to life in captivity. He was still young, still injured, yet more resilient than ever. His body and mind, tempered by the fall, the war, and the harsh realities of imprisonment, had become instruments of endurance. The story of survival was far from over, for the greatest test, freedom, escape, and the final days of the war, still lay ahead. The winter of 1943 was harsh in the German prisoner of war camp. Cold winds whipped across the barracks, seeping through gaps in the walls and chilling the bones of the prisoners. Alan Magee, still recovering from the extraordinary injuries sustained during his fall, had learned to endure the relentless discomfort, rationing warmth and energy wherever possible. Each day was a battle against the elements, hunger, and the invisible strain of mental fatigue. Despite the harsh conditions, Alan observed patterns in the camp. The guards, though strict, followed routines. Meals, inspections, and work assignments occurred at precise intervals. Every detail was a potential opportunity. An overlooked schedule, a gap in supervision, a misstep by a guard, could be leveraged to improve life in captivity or, for some daring, to attempt escape. Alan's mind remained sharp, honed by months of survival, observation, and adaptability. The prisoners themselves were a microcosm of the war. Men from diverse backgrounds, ranks, and units shared stories of their lives before the conflict, their triumphs and tragedies. Alan learned to navigate these relationships with sensitivity, balancing the need for camaraderie with the reality of limited resources and the constant threat of scrutiny by the guards. In these interactions, he found solace, humor, and strength, a human lifeline in the desolation of captivity. One afternoon, a rumor circulated among the prisoners: Allied forces were making advances along the French coast. Hushed conversations filled the barracks, as hope flickered tentatively in the hearts of men who had known little but hardship. Alan listened carefully, evaluating the credibility of the reports. He knew that hope could be dangerous if it led to rash action, yet he could not deny the stirrings of optimism. The war was dynamic, change was possible, and liberation might one day arrive. Physical rehabilitation continued. Alan's injuries, though partially healed, required constant care. Broken ribs, bruised limbs, and lingering pain from the fall demanded patience and ingenuity. Using whatever tools were available, he devised exercises to maintain mobility and strength, often inspiring fellow prisoners to do the same. His survival had become more than a personal miracle, it was a beacon of endurance, proving to others that the human body and spirit could endure extraordinary hardship. The psychological challenges were relentless. Nightmares of falling, of the deafening roar of flak, and of the disintegrating B-17 haunted Alan's sleep. Yet he developed strategies to cope: mental exercises, reflection on past successes, and visualization of survival scenarios. These techniques allowed him to retain clarity and focus in a setting designed to erode morale. Opportunities for small acts of resistance emerged. Messages were secretly passed between prisoners, food was occasionally redistributed through ingenuity, and minor repairs to clothing and equipment were undertaken in secret. Alan participated carefully, knowing that even minor successes bolstered morale and reinforced the sense of agency among the men. Each act, though small, was a defiance of the constraints imposed by captivity. As spring approached, the camp dynamics shifted. New prisoners arrived, bringing stories of recent battles and the relentless pace of the war. Alan absorbed these accounts, refining his understanding of the larger conflict. The knowledge that the Allies were gaining ground fueled quiet anticipation among the prisoners, though they understood that liberation might still be months away. Alan's reputation as a resilient and resourceful prisoner grew. Fellow prisoners looked to him for guidance, and even some guards recognized his calm composure and intelligence. He became a central figure in the social fabric of the camp, not through authority, but through example. His presence inspired others to endure, to find strength in adversity, and to maintain hope against overwhelming odds. One particularly harsh week, food supplies were further reduced, and temperatures plummeted. Alan, drawing on his experiences from the fall and months in captivity, organized fellow prisoners to conserve resources, share warmth, and maintain morale. They rationed food strategically, alternated tasks to preserve energy, and developed signals to communicate quietly. Each measure, though small, contributed to the survival of the group and reinforced the importance of collective resilience. Amid these hardships, Alan's thoughts often returned to the miraculous fall that had brought him to this point. He reflected on the physics-defying survival, the luck, and the human ingenuity that had allowed him to endure. This reflection was not mere nostalgia, it was a source of psychological strength, a reminder that he had faced death and emerged alive. The fall had forged in him a profound understanding: survival depended on preparation, adaptability, and the unyielding will to live. Over time, the monotony of camp life was punctuated by events that reminded Alan and his fellow prisoners of the war beyond the fences. Air raids, distant gunfire, and movement of supplies hinted at the shifting tides of battle. Each signal was analyzed, shared quietly, and used to anticipate changes in the camp environment. Alan's strategic observation skills, honed by months of survival, allowed him to guide fellow prisoners in making informed choices, preserving life and morale. Letters and messages from home were rare but treasured. Alan clung to each word, reading them repeatedly, drawing strength and perspective. They were reminders of life beyond the barbed wire, of family waiting, and of the world he hoped to rejoin one day. These fragments of connection reinforced his determination to endure, to survive, and to reclaim the life that had been nearly taken from him. As the months passed, Alan began contemplating the possibility of escape, not as a reckless act, but as a calculated measure. He studied the guards' routines, the camp's layout, and potential weaknesses. Patience and careful observation were crucial. He realized that surviving the fall had taught him more than physical endurance. It had cultivated strategic thinking, awareness of risk, and the psychological resilience necessary to act decisively when opportunity arose. By late 1944, whispers of approaching Allied forces became more frequent. The prisoners' morale surged cautiously. Alan, while cautiously optimistic, continued to prioritize preparation over hope alone. His experience had taught him that survival required action, adaptability, and vigilance. The war was nearing its climax, and the coming months would test everything he had learned, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Part 5 closes on a note of tension and anticipation. Alan Magee, the young airman who had fallen 6 kilometers without a parachute and survived, had endured the harshest trials of captivity. His body and mind had been tempered by adversity, his resilience unbroken, and his spirit strengthened. The story was far from over: liberation, confrontation with fate, and the final chapter of his extraordinary journey still lay ahead. The air in the prisoner-of-war camp carried a subtle shift, a whisper of change that Alan Magee could feel even before it became visible. Spring of 1945 brought with it the rumblings of Allied victories and the undeniable retreat of German forces. The prisoners, months, even years, removed from the battlefields, sensed that freedom was no longer a distant dream but a tangible possibility. Yet the path to liberation would not be simple, and Alan knew that survival demanded vigilance until the very last moment. Morning routines continued as before: roll calls, inspections, labor, but the mood among the men had changed. Conversations were infused with cautious optimism. Hushed speculations of approaching Allied troops circulated through the barracks. Alan observed these developments keenly, noting which guards were deserting, which routes to potential safety were accessible, and which signals hinted at the collapse of German control. His strategic mind, sharpened by survival and captivity, saw patterns others missed. Alan's injuries, though mostly healed, left him with lingering pain. Each step reminded him of the miraculous fall that had brought him here, the agony of those first hours, and the slow, painful rehabilitation that had followed. Despite discomfort, he moved with purpose, aiding fellow prisoners, boosting morale, and quietly sharing his survival strategies. He had become a mentor of sorts, embodying resilience and hope. Then came the day that had been long anticipated. The camp gates, once guarded with relentless precision, were thrown open by advancing Allied forces. German soldiers either fled or surrendered without resistance. The air was filled with disbelief, jubilation, and tears. Alan, alongside his fellow prisoners, stepped into the light, feeling the warmth of freedom on skin that had known cold, hardship, and confinement for far too long. Walking out of the camp, Alan's eyes scanned the horizon. The war was not yet over, but for him, a chapter of unimaginable trials had ended. He had survived a fall of 6 kilometers without a parachute, endured months of captivity, and faced the relentless uncertainties of war. Each step forward was a reclaiming of life that had been nearly lost. The landscape beyond the camp, scarred by conflict yet filled with movement and life, seemed almost surreal after years of confinement. Medical teams attended to the liberated prisoners, tending to lingering injuries, malnutrition, and trauma. Alan, though battered, exhibited remarkable recovery. Doctors marveled at his resilience, noting the miraculous survival of the fall and his subsequent endurance under extreme conditions. For Alan, the medical attention was welcome, but it also marked the beginning of another challenge: reintegration into a world that had continued without him, a life that awaited him far from the skies of war. Letters from family and friends had begun arriving even before the liberation, and Alan read each one with reverent care. He imagined the faces of loved ones, the familiar landscapes of Erie, Pennsylvania, and the life that had been put on hold. Hope, once a fragile ember, now blazed brightly. Yet Alan's mind, tempered by the realities of war, knew that reintegration would demand patience and adjustment. The psychological aftermath of his experiences was profound. Nights were still haunted by visions of the fall, the chaos of the B-17 under fire, and the months of captivity. Yet Alan approached these memories not as a source of despair, but as lessons, testaments to the strength of human spirit and will. Each recollection reinforced the understanding that survival depended not solely on luck, but on courage, ingenuity, and resilience. As Alan traveled back to Allied-controlled territory, he encountered soldiers, journalists, and civilians, all eager to hear his story. His account of the 6-kilometer fall became a symbol of the extraordinary possibilities of survival. Reporters wrote of the miracle airman, fellow soldiers recounted the incredible odds, and historians began to study the event as an exceptional case of human endurance. Yet for Alan, the true significance lay not in notoriety, but in the reaffirmation of life itself. Upon returning to the United States, Alan was greeted with a mixture of celebration, curiosity, and reverence. Family members wept, friends marveled, and the nation, embroiled in the broader narrative of World War II, found inspiration in his story. Yet Alan remained humble, emphasizing the role of chance, human aid, and determination in his survival. He understood that his journey, while extraordinary, was intertwined with countless others, men and women whose courage, sacrifice, and resilience had shaped the outcome of the war. The months following his return were dedicated to recovery, reflection, and adjustment. Alan pursued physical therapy to restore full mobility, engaged in conversations with medical professionals about the implications of his fall, and began the slow process of reintegrating into civilian life. Each milestone, walking without pain, resuming simple routines, reconnecting with family, was a victory, a reaffirmation of the extraordinary journey that had begun in the skies over France. Alan's story gradually became part of the historical record. Lectures, interviews, and written accounts preserved the memory of his survival, serving both as education and inspiration. Young airmen, students, and historians marveled at the details: the fall from 6 kilometers, the shattered B-17, the miraculous roof, and the endurance in captivity. It became a story of resilience against impossible odds, a narrative demonstrating the profound strength of the human spirit. Reflecting on his experiences, Alan recognized that the war had imparted lessons far beyond survival. Courage was not a single heroic act, but a continuous commitment to endure challenges, maintain hope, and act decisively in moments of danger. Resilience was cultivated through adversity, sharpened by reflection, and sustained by human connection. And perhaps most importantly, life, once nearly extinguished, was a gift to be cherished with every breath. By the end of Part 6, Alan Magee had returned to his homeland, physically and psychologically transformed by his journey. The miraculous fall, the trials of captivity, and the relentless challenges of war had forged a man of extraordinary resilience. Yet the story, while reaching a climax with liberation, would continue to inspire, as Alan reflected, shared, and recounted the lessons of survival for the rest of his life. The world Alan Magee returned to was vastly different from the one he had left behind. Cities were rebuilding, families were reuniting, and the scars of war remained visible in every corner. For Alan, the transition was both exhilarating and challenging. The miraculous survival from the fall of 6 kilometers over France had ended, but life demanded new battles, those of reintegration, healing, and finding purpose in peacetime. Alan's recovery continued steadily. Physical therapy became routine, allowing him to regain strength and mobility. Every step forward was a triumph, a testament to the resilience that had carried him through the fall, captivity, and months of uncertainty. Yet alongside the physical healing, he faced emotional and psychological challenges. Nightmares persisted, reminders of the chaotic sky, the B-17 disintegrating around him, and the terrifying free fall that had nearly ended his life. He sought support from friends, family, and fellow veterans who understood the unique trauma of war. Through these connections, Alan began to process his experiences. He reflected deeply on the delicate balance between fate, human will, and chance that had allowed him to survive. The realization that life could be extinguished in an instant, yet had been preserved against all odds, instilled in him a profound appreciation for every moment, every relationship, and every opportunity. The story of Alan Magee's survival spread rapidly. Newspapers, military records, and historians chronicled his fall, turning it into a symbol of extraordinary resilience. Interviews, lectures, and public appearances followed. Yet Alan remained humble. He emphasized not only the miraculous nature of his survival but also the human kindness he had encountered, the villagers who rescued him, the doctors who treated him, and the camaraderie of his fellow prisoners who shared strength in adversity. His story was as much about humanity as it was about survival. Alan also began to reflect on the larger lessons of war. He considered the countless men who had not survived, the friends lost in missions, and the innumerable acts of courage and sacrifice that remained unrecorded. His own survival, while extraordinary, was part of a vast tapestry of human endurance, reminding him that individual resilience was intertwined with collective effort and support. As he reintegrated into civilian life, Alan pursued education and career opportunities. He applied the same focus, discipline, and determination that had carried him through survival to every endeavor. His experiences shaped his worldview, teaching him patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of maintaining hope and integrity even in the most challenging circumstances. Over time, Alan became a mentor and symbol for others facing adversity. His story inspired not only soldiers and veterans but also ordinary people confronting personal challenges. He emphasized that survival was not merely a matter of luck but a combination of preparation, courage, adaptability, and the unyielding refusal to surrender to despair. These lessons resonated broadly, transcending the specific context of war. Alan's legacy extended beyond his immediate survival. He contributed to military research, offering insights into human endurance, the effects of extreme trauma, and strategies for psychological resilience. His experiences informed studies on the limits of human physiology and psychology, providing invaluable data for training, rehabilitation, and support of future soldiers. Personal life flourished as well. Alan nurtured relationships with family and friends, sharing his story selectively while emphasizing the lessons rather than the sensational aspects. He married, raised a family, and worked to build a life grounded in the appreciation of survival, resilience, and human connection. Each day became an opportunity to honor the second chance he had been granted, to live with purpose, and to impart the values of courage and endurance to those around him. Public recognition came, but Alan never sought fame. He valued the quiet acknowledgement of his peers, the gratitude of family, and the knowledge that his survival had inspired hope and resilience in others. He often reflected on the fall, the B-17, the months in captivity, and the liberation with a sense of humility, understanding that life's miraculous moments were intertwined with effort, courage, and the support of others. In his later years, Alan Magee shared his experiences through lectures, memoirs, and interviews. The young airman who had fallen 6 kilometers without a parachute became a living testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. His story taught that even in the face of overwhelming odds, survival, recovery, and a meaningful life were possible. Each telling reinforced the message: courage, adaptability, hope, and human connection could overcome adversity of unimaginable magnitude. Alan's journey, from the chaotic skies over occupied France to the freedom and stability of post-war life, left an indelible mark. His survival was not an isolated miracle, it was a culmination of personal courage, collective support, and the unpredictable hand of fate. Yet it served as a beacon, demonstrating that even in the direst circumstances, the human spirit could endure, adapt, and triumph. The legacy of Alan Magee endures as a story of extraordinary survival, a narrative that inspires generations. It is a reminder that courage is cultivated in adversity, resilience is strengthened through trial, and life, once nearly lost, is a gift to be cherished and shared. His experiences, though rooted in the extreme context of war, offer timeless lessons for all, that even when faced with the impossible, the human spirit has the capacity to endure, to hope, and to overcome. As Part 7 concludes, Alan Magee's story reaches its final chapter in the narrative of survival, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit. From the catastrophic fall, through months of captivity, to liberation and rebuilding life, Alan exemplifies what it means to survive the unthinkable and emerge not only alive but profoundly transformed. His life serves as an enduring testament to the extraordinary potential within every individual to overcome adversity, embrace hope, and live fully, no matter the odds.